Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles individuals who are passionate about what they do for a living, about what organization they belong to, or simply passionate about the community they are a part of. Hello there and welcome. My name is Dave Cunningham. John Turner was our 17th Prime Minister. He served for a short 79 days back in 1984. Following his death in September, much has been said and written about this great Canadian. I thought it would be interesting to spend some time with Arthur Milnes, a historian who focuses on Canadian Prime Ministers and a good friend of John Turner's. Our conversation was recorded using Zoom on October 20th. Art, welcome back to the program.
I hope you guys aren't sick of me.
No, heck no. What I wanted to do on the program today is talk about our 17th Prime Minister who passed away in September and your friend, John Turner. And I think that many of us have been reminded of his accomplishments as a politician. And I want to spend a little time on that, but I'd like to spend most of the program talking about your relationship with him and have you tell us some of the stories which stick out in your mind. So for those who may have forgotten some of the political accomplishments of Mr. Turner, why don't you give us a brief overview of his career?
Well, Mr. Turner was definitely a Renaissance man in the sense that he was a brilliant young man as a student. He had it all. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He was an athlete, incredible forward-looking progressive ideas. He actually, one of his really first impacts on Canadian politics took place right here in Kingston, was in 1960. People have to remember that John Diefenbaker and his Conservatives, they didn't just defeat Lester Pearson's Liberals in 1958, they crushed them. And to his credit, Mr. Pearson spent those years in the wilderness preparing his Liberal Party for power. It's one of the most impressive periods of any leader of the opposition in Canadian history, I would argue. And as part of it, in September 1960, the Liberal Party had a thinkers conference called the Kingston Conference that took place at Queen's University. And the party gathered a collection of large L liberals, names that would, go on in Liberal Party history and Canadian history as great forces for change in politics, like Alan McKechnie or Tom Kent, who lived in Kingston for many years. And one of the young people who came to that conference was a young lawyer, president of the Young Lawyers Bar Association in Montreal. And his name was John Napier Turner. And Mr. Turner, and he wasn't a partisan liberal at the time. So, like I said, to Lester Pearson's credit, they brought in voices from not just their own party. And Mr. Turner, as a young lawyer, gave a passionate presentation about the need for legal aid in Canada. And then if we zip ahead a few years, after making this very important debut, if you want to call it, amongst a group of very important thinkers and liberals, years later, he became Attorney General of Canada and Minister of Justice, and he was able to pilot and implement that legal aid system. So over the years, whenever he would speak, particularly to young people, he would always talk about how he was able to, because he got involved in the public issues of the day, he was able to argue for legal aid, but then later, because he got involved, he was able to implement. So, quite a story. And he used to, like I said, tell that to young people as an example of what you can do if you get involved. So he was elected again as this very bright young star candidate in 1962. And he quickly began his rise through through our federal political system. But he was quite interesting in the sense that he was always pegged as a reformer. And these days, for the last 20 years, all we ever talk about is the decline in the role of the average member of parliament. Well, Mr. Turner was fighting for increased roles for the member of parliament from the moment he entered the place in 1962. And he also brought a very unique style that unfortunately has gone by the wayside today, which is he defined in many ways the old maxim that one can disagree in politics without being disagreeable.
Right.
And when he entered Mr. Pearson's cabinet, he was known for his consultation with members of the Conservative Party and the NDP Party. He was popular behind the scenes. Everybody liked him. And he had quite a career in this 1960s before he assumed the highest office in the land.
So Lester B. Pearson resigns, and so there's a convention, and so he runs for the leadership.
Yeah, and he's the, people think because Mr. Trudeau Sr. won, people have forgotten that convention. And John Turner was considered the intellectual of that race. Like I said earlier, the Rhodes Scholar. He attracted young people to his campaign. And his campaign, and this matters in politics, was considered the most fun. Right, all the fun, cool, hip young people were with Mr. Turner. And what I loved is when he spoke to the convention before the voting, he said that my time is now. I'm not running for some hypothetical future convention in 1984. Which is when he actually did win the leadership, was 1984. So he was quite famous for when he was knocked off the ballot, because people forget again how close Pierre Trudeau came to losing that convention. When Mr. Turner was knocked off the ballot, and I honestly can't remember how far into it, 4 or 5 ballots, he released his delegates. He didn't tell them, please go support Pierre Trudeau or Bob Winters. He had 195 delegates at the end, and out of that grew the famous 195 Club. And as the years went on, there were probably 10,000 members of the 195 Club, right? Everybody would say they were one of those last Turner delegates. But so Mr. Trudeau won that convention, and John Turner was quickly brought in to hold Mr. Trudeau's very important portfolio that Trudeau himself had held, which was Minister of Justice. So that was a sign of Trudeau's faith in Mr.
So after spending some time in cabinet and then basically retiring from politics for a bit, he comes back and he wins the leadership when Pierre Trudeau retires.
Yeah.
And so he becomes prime minister, but he was prime minister for a very short period of time.
Yes, you have to remember that by the time John Turner becomes leader of the Liberal Party and prime minister, the Liberals have been in basically 16 years in power. They're a tired government. They're wildly unpopular, particularly in Western Canada. And Mr. Turner takes over. And, we can argue about this till the cows come home. He immediately calls an election. And a lot of people, Brian Mulroney being one of them, say that Mr. Turner would have probably been smarter to have stayed in office a little longer and took part in the Pope's tour of Canada in the fall of 1984 and the royal tour by Her Majesty the Queen. It would have got him on TV every night in a nonpartisan sense with these two beloved figures. And instead, Mr. Turner famously flew over to London, asked the Queen's permission to delay her trip, came back and called the election. And Mr. Mulroney and his team were well funded. They had their plan. Brian Mulroney was young. He represented change. In particular, he promised and delivered a whole new connection, a historic one, for French Canada. In effect, Brian Mulroney was French Canadian. He's of English-Irish heritage, but he grew up in Quebec completely bicultural. So I would argue today that John Turner didn't have a chance.
Yeah.
But he ran the campaign. I don't think he would disagree with me that it was an awful campaign. And Brian Mulroney won the largest majority in Canadian history with 200. Picture this: 211 seats, and the mighty Liberal Party was reduced to 40 seats. And at this point, here is where I really grew to respect and admire Mr. Turner. He had every reason in the fall of 1984 just to pack it in. And he could have returned to Bay Street and made zillions of dollars. Yeah. And instead, he stayed. And by the time the next election came along, he had doubled his party's representation in the House. He had reformed many internal mechanisms in his party, opened it up to a whole bunch of, in particular, new Canadians. And many would argue he prepared the party to assume power again in 1993 under Mr. Chrétien. So it was, the later part of his career was a series of ups and downs. Obviously, he achieved the highest office in the land and then quickly lost it. Mm-hmm. But again, he stayed, and he was Brian Mulroney, as you know. I was Mr. Mulroney's research assistant on his memoirs. And Mr. Mulroney always considered John Turner a formidable opponent, both in the House of Commons and on the hustings, particularly in 1988. But what I particularly enjoyed was I was 5 years with Mr. Mulroney on his memoirs, and I never once heard him, in public or private, make a derogatory personal comment about John Turner. And the whole time I also knew Mr. Turner very well. And I never heard that from Mr. Turner either. Theirs was, they fought each other real hard. But it was a fight over issues, free trade being the most important one. And I tell young people today, I was a university student in 1988 when the entire election was fought on one issue, which was free trade. And imagine that today. I say to people, well, for 7 weeks, these two strong, articulate men, leaders of their respective parties, went around the country in front of all of us, and they debated an issue, a real issue. That was, it wasn't about what you said on Facebook 10 years ago. It was about a fundamentally important issue, which was free trade with the United States of America. And the voting turnout was something like 76 or 77%. In my case, I remember my grandmother and myself fighting and raising our voices at each other the night before. I remember at my part-time job, all of us arguing about free trade. So yes, the Conservatives were reelected, and Brian Mulroney was able to implement free trade. But I've never felt that anybody won or lost that campaign in that sense, because both sides were aired respectfully. And as a result, our system of democracy won in 1988, I would argue.
Give people the opportunity to have their say.
Yeah.
When did you meet John Turner for the first time?
Well, the first time I ever spoke to him was actually when I was in the Northwest Territories. I was a reporter up there. And because of my interest in politics, somebody phoned me at the newspaper, the Yellowknifer, one day and said that John Turner had just been in town for a holiday. And I snooped around, and sure enough, he was. And he and his family were quite close to a man named Bob Engel. And he was quite a pioneering pilot in the Northwest Territories and the Eastern Arctic as well. And so I phoned Mr. Turner's law office and left a message and just asked if he'd want to do a featurey, non-hard news type story about his friendship with Bob Engel. And Mr. Turner phoned me back and I said, look, sir, I don't want to do anything political. I'm not going to get you any trouble. And so we did this wonderful interview about Bob Engel. I'll never forget the headline my editors chose, which was "A Great Slave Friendship." But here was the funny part. At the end of the conversation, two things happened once the formal interview ended. One was he was very encouraging of the fact that a young Canadian from Southern Ontario had decided to go experience life north of 60. And it really struck me because most of my friends and family thought I was nuts to have picked up and moved to the Arctic. But he was very encouraging. But the funny thing that happened was, remember, I had pledged to him that I wouldn't drag him into any political issues or anything. But he himself brought up his opposition to the new diamond mines being opened in the Northwest Territories and how they were going to ruin the environment. So naturally, I reported on that, of course, right? And my own newspaper ran an editorial attacking John Turner, right? And here it was. I had no intention, but Mr. Turner was a big boy, and he's been attacked by many editorial boards over the years, so I don't think it cost him sleep.
So by this time, he's out of politics.
Oh, yeah. This was 1995.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So then 3 or 4 years later, I started as a reporter at the Kingston Whig Standard. And my wife and I moved down from the Northwest Territories to live in Kingston, where we still are. And I quickly found out that once a year, Mr. Turner would come to Kingston for board meetings of Empire Life. So I phoned him one day because I heard the board meeting was coming up. And I said, sir, let me tell you some flavor. Sorry, before I tell the story. He always answered the phone at work the same way. And he would pick up the phone and say, John Turner. And he had this, that was what his voice was like. And I said, well, sir, I'm at the Kingston Whig Standard. I'm a reporter. You won't remember, but I interviewed you a few years ago in the NWT. Why don't I'd like to interview you while you're here in Kingston. And he said, okay, pick me up at the train. So I did. And we retired to a bar, and I did a Q&A with him. Again, I tried not to drag him into today's politics or that day's politics. I was more interested in stories from his career. So after the interview was over, we shared a few scotches, and he just told me war stories from his career. And he, for a whole 15-year period or so, Mr. Turner was at everything in Canadian politics. So anyway, so the story ran. I did an old-fashioned thing that young reporters today rarely do, which is when the paper came out, unheard of today, I actually hand wrote a thank you letter to Mr. Turner and mailed the story to his office. And he phoned me and was quite appreciative. So that began a tradition. And every year I would pick him up at the train. And I would write about it in the newspaper in some of my columns. And then one year it was quite funny. A local rental car rental place called me, and the owner was quite a fan of John Turner's. So he said, "Look, are you picking up Mr. Turner this month when he's here for his board meetings?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Okay, drop by and I'll lend you a car so Mr. Turner can be picked up in style." So there it was, a brand new bright red convertible. So I'd never forget, it had 61 kilometers on it, and it was probably worth more than my house. And I drove off to the train station in this convertible. The only time in my life I've actually ever driven one, and met Mr. Turner at the train. And we walked out to the parking lot, and there was this bright red car. And in previous years, I'd picked him up in my Ford Festiva, and we walked towards the car, and he stopped, and he said, "Arthur, you're not still working at the Whig Standard if you can afford this baby." So it was that Mr. Turner and the 17th Prime Minister and myself went driving through the streets of Kingston, and he was interesting. There were a whole bunch of sites that he wanted to see. Right, he wanted to see the prison for women and Kingston Penitentiary. He wanted to drive through Royal Military College, Fort Henry, Queen's University, all these places he had been throughout his career. And I was just loving it. There I was, with a former prime minister in a brand new red convertible on a beautifully warm day. I was in heaven. So then we went to a bar and had our scotch again.
There's a story going around that I had not heard of prior to his passing, and that's the story of his relationship with Princess Margaret. Do you know much about that?
Oh, of course I do. I once, during an interview with him, directly asked him how far it had gone, if you know what I mean. And Mr. Turner said, "Arthur, I can't believe you, of all people, are asking me that." And then he gave me an answer. And I've never reported the answer. I've never written it down, and I never will tell anybody.
But apparently Princess Margaret did say in one of her books or her life story or whatever that she almost married him.
Yeah, I didn't realize that she had written that. But that was, again, he was a young man and a politician. I heard a mutual friend of ours, Scott Reed, very well known in liberal politics, say at the time of Mr. Turner's death that John Turner was the full package, and he was. Mm-hmm. Good looks, raced Roger Bannister when he was at Oxford, Rhodes Scholar, liked by everybody. He had even danced with Princess Margaret. So he had quite a life in career.
Now, tell the story of the Queen's Model Parliament that was set up. I don't know how many years ago that was, where you were asked to invite him to act as speaker.
It was one of the most moving experiences I ever had with John Turner, because if you knew anything about John Turner, he was one of those rare members of Parliament who earned the unofficial designation as a House of Commons man. Very few in his era, obviously Mr. Diefenbaker, Paul Martin Sr., Alan McKechnie, and only a few others you would call a House of Commons man. But for John Turner, he believed in the majesty of Parliament. He loved every second in that chamber. So the members of the Queen's Model Parliament asked me if I could help get Mr. Turner to serve as honorary speaker for one of their sessions. And Peter Milliken, then speaker, had arranged for the students to actually have their model parliament in the House of Commons itself. So it was very moving I got to introduce him. My first time at the speaker's podium in the House, and only time in the House of Commons. And Mr. Turner, who was in great pain, because of his years as an athlete, his knees were shot. He had chronic back problems. But he walked onto that floor of his beloved House of Commons, and in a flash, he was a 40 or 35-year-old MP again. And he spoke to the students and eagerly presided over a session of question period for him. And I could be wrong, but I think that was the last time, it was about 10 years ago, that he was ever on the floor of the House. And to have played a small role in that was very important to me. And not too long ago, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, he phoned me out of the blue. And he said, in that great voice of his, he said, "Arthur, can you get to Toronto tomorrow before I change my mind?" And I said, "Okay, what's up?" And he said, "You got to buy me lunch, and you'll see when you get here." So I said, "Okay." So I got in the car the next morning and drove to Toronto and went to Mr. Turner's condominium. And as I pulled up, I could see him sitting in this chair that looked really familiar. The type of style of chair looked familiar to me from my years watching Question Period in the House of Commons. And Mr. Turner gave me his House of Commons chair. And I treasure that.
Now, that's something that a lot of people don't really realize, I would guess, how important that chair would be to a member of Parliament who is leaving the Commons.
Yes, his caucus, when he retired, bought the chair from the House of Commons itself, and they had a plaque on it, and it says, "The Right Honourable John Turner, House of Commons man." And that's what I sit in my own home office now. I was very touched. I kind of speechless even today that he gave me that. Mm-hmm. And someday when I go, I'll make sure it goes to a important public museum or something.
Now, we've talked about before this backyard of yours that includes trees and shrubs. And it's only prime ministers and presidents that get a tree. So John Turner does have a tree in your backyard.
And he was my first.
What kind of tree is it?
Yeah, it's called a smoke tree. And I was going to pick him up. And the day before, I said to my wife, I said, "Allison, I have a crazy idea." And she said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, what if I ask Mr. Turner to plant a tree in our garden and we'll put a plaque on it?" And she said, "Wow, that's not a bad idea." So I quickly went to the mall and I had a plaque engraved, and a friend of mine, my next door neighbor, Steve, he made a stake that would fit the plaque. And I had inscribed on the plaque, "This tree planted by the Right Honourable John Turner, 17th Prime Minister," and then the date. And but keep in mind, I hadn't asked Mr. Turner if he would do it. And I went over to Canadian Tire and I bought a tree. I didn't know what kind of tree to get. I just bought one. And I dug a hole and I put the tree in it. And I prepared a wheelbarrow with the soil. I bought a special shovel. And I put Canadian flags all around the tree. And then I went to the train station and picked up Mr. Turner. And we were driving along, and I said, "Sir, can you do me a favor?" And he says, "What's that?" And I said, would you mind coming over to my house and planting a ceremonial tree in my garden?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "Can you come and plant a tree?" And I pulled the plaque out of my pocket, and I handed it to him. And he said, "All right, let's go for it. Do you have any scotch?" I said, "Yes, sir." Because I had bought his favorite scotch just in case he said yes. So over he came to my house, and we had a few scotches. And then he said, "Okay, let's do the tree thing." And off we went, just him and my wife and I. And he threw a scoop of soil into the hole. And then he said, "Arthur, I haven't done that in years. I'm going to put another scoop in." And he threw another scoop in too, and that began my tree program. And then he always, not just me, he was religious about sending Christmas cards. to his list of, like I said, his 195 club that had 10,000 members. Must have taken John Turner weeks to do his Christmas cards every year. And he started to refer to his tree whenever he'd send us a Christmas card. And somewhere along this line, I started to work for Brian Mulroney on his memoirs. And he would write these funny notes in his Christmas card. And he'd say, Arthur, don't let Mulroney touch my tree. And stuff like that. And, so that was a lot of fun. So he was my first.
What do you think his legacy will be?
I think his legacy, particularly when you look at today's politics, I think his legacy will be decency. It's hard to find a person in politics or the media who didn't like John Turner. And one story I'm aware of is, it's just a small example of his courtesy, is after he was leader of the Liberal Party, he was still a member of Parliament. And the first ever Reform Party MP, Deborah Gray, was elected. And she and her staff at the time will tell you how the other parties, for the most part, treated Ms. Gray as cancer. You know, the idea of this upstart reform party sending an MP to Ottawa. Whereas they'll tell you that the only MP that went out of his way to honor her presence in Parliament was her political foe, John Turner. And he was a master of the personal gesture. He phoned everybody on their birthdays. And so, again, just a style of politics of respect. And as we continue on the way, that's for a whole other show, but the decline in public discourse, thanks to the internet and stuff, is quite palpable these days, particularly when you see what's going on south of the border. So John Turner, that would be his legacy, would be, in my view, a style of politics that we are sorely lacking today. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he used to always say he loved talking to young people. And he would always say the same thing. He would say, next to the ministry of God, because he's a very religious man, there's no higher calling than public service. And I would agree with him. He respected if you ran for the school board or the city council or the town council or for the provincial legislature or the House of Commons itself. He had a great respect. And another thing about Mr. Turner and other leaders of his era, and even today, let's be fair, John Turner spent a total of 25 years in the House of Commons. Think of those 25 years represented his best earning years. And he was one of Canada's top lawyers, businessmen, and business people. He could have made millions. Mm-hmm. And instead of raking in that money, he chose public service. And even today, let's be fair, Justin Trudeau has a lot better things to do than to serve as prime minister, and so does Aaron O'Toole and others. And I think we have to remember that sometimes. And John Turner is a prime example of that. He didn't need to be leader of the opposition, flying around speaking to Rotary clubs in small towns in Manitoba, Ontario, and PEI. But he did it because he believed in public service. That's a great legacy.
We need more John Turners.
What a great way of putting it. I 100% agree. And I'm confident, and I think he would be, that we'll get them. We have to.
Yeah. Arthur, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate your reminiscing about John Turner.
He was a great man, great Canadian, and a great friend.
Theme music for the program is Stasis Oasis, a tune written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of our episodes, please send a note to the Kingstonian Podcast Facebook page. This is Dave Cunningham from Kingston, Ontario. Thank you for listening. Until next time.